Okay, so this podcast is all about methodological naturalism. There was a person called Brian Bizzle who thinks that using methodological naturalism in science is, in his words, a logical fallacy. So I to get Brian Bizzle on here to say why he thought it was a logical fallacy and what criteria he could use to differentiate natural events via supernatural events. But unfortunately, Brian isn't here with us, but I'm sure he'll have a lot to say. So with me, I have two very well-read people, Christopher Malty, who runs a lab somewhere in the US, and Gary Edwards, who's a philosopher of science, and myself, who's a mathematical physicist. Okay, so I guess the first thing we ought to do is perhaps talk about the natural versus the supernatural. Mm-hmm. So, sorry, Gary?
Yep.
So the natural thing to do is we will try and give a half decent definition of what natural events are. Now, I've been thinking about this. We have a viewer.
It's news.
Yes, my events are so popular. So, so when we think of perhaps natural events, or when I think of as a natural event, as a mathematical physicist, I think about something that will always obey some sort of rule. For example, gravity is a natural event because, as far as we can see, it always obeys Newton's law of gravitation or Einstein's theory of general relativity or something like that. So when we measure acceleration due to gravity on all over the Earth, we use the same equation, and this will always give us a very accurate answer. So that would be an example of perhaps a natural mechanism or a natural phenomenon, i.e. gravity. So this sort of proto definition, does that make sense to the rest of you?
Yeah, that's a nomic definition of naturalism. Yeah.
What definition?
Nomic, law-based. The laws in question are universal natural laws. You can formulise them as if-then statements in all circumstances. And it's obedience to those laws, if then in their being natural, that makes them natural laws. The problem is you still might need to define what natural is in order to ensure that these things are obeying natural laws.
So and also there is, I was thinking, another problem with that is when you have things like random events. We don't have any particular laws to actually say that, for example, turbulence in fluid flow, we can write down various sets of equations, but can we actually get a very good representation of the actual of the actual phenomena using the equations we have? So that I was thinking that would be possibly something that we need to add into our definition of natural, being obeying some sort of probability distribution as well.
Rather than just strictly, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, rather than a clear deductive equation like Newton's law of gravitation gives you very much if-then, as you said, but things like turbulence, you're going to have to perhaps deal with probability distribution. So we also have to add in various laws obeying some sort of stochastic ideas. So that's also quite a thing. So now we have. I mean, you said that that's a normic. I mean, are there any other things?
Yes, sure. There are many definitions of what nature means.
Are they equivalent in some logical sense?
Some of them, most of them would be compatible with that. Some wouldn't, but most would. Generally, it'd be, from a philosophical point of view, it'd be undertaken from a definition of terms, and then it'd probably be extended to cover laws. So you might start off with some idea of what nature means, and then you might try and narrow it down to what set of conditions would be both sufficient and necessary for something being natural, as opposed to its being supernatural or non-natural. You'd also have to make a distinction between non and super, because those can mean two different things as well. Sorry, yeah, Karen.
So in one. So okay. So I think I think natural is sort of well understood, right?
It's a controversial issue. No, there are controversies there. I mean, some people will, for example, limit it. Will say, well, what is natural is what belongs to a spatio-temporal realm of particulars. What is of the cosmos. Yeah. So others will, like I will, for example, will probably define it in a way that doesn't necessarily need to be limited to a spatio-temporal realm or particulars. So I, for example, might define something is natural. If we take it apart, so we start with the idea of substance, and we go for a minimal substrate view, a minimal semantic substrate view. So substances are basically just semantic figments. That's their minimal content. And then you can, so they're like the grammatical subjects in statements or sentences. The cat in the cat set on the map. They're just grammatical placeholders, though. They don't necessarily have to denote a cat at this stage. What you can do then is you can assign different sets of predicates to these basic grammatical placeholders. So on the one hand, when you're talking about something that is a substance, the predications, the properties, if you like, that you would assign to that would be simplicity, durability, and independence. And you'd assign those in probably such a way as that the substance is the simplest, most durable, and most independent thing under consideration. And that would give you a definition of substance. And then what I do to differentiate the material or the natural from the supernatural is, I think the supernatural is something that is a substance. A substance is supernatural if it has all the attributes of a substance and intentional relations or intentionality. That is, it's fundamentally psychological, and it would be natural if it's fundamentally non-psychological.
Yes, that's something that I was thinking about of what the supernatural is. I was thinking that the supernatural has some psychological intent behind the actions that it does.
But in its essence, in the most fundamental, but simplest, durable, and independent terms of which it can be talked about, it is fundamentally psychological, whereas the natural is fundamentally not psychological. So you could still be a naturalist and without denying the existence of mind. It's just that the mind isn't at the fundamental, substantial level of existence in a naturalistic world picture. It emerges out of things that are not psychological.
Yes, I mean the mind, as far as I'm concerned, it's an emergent property from the neurobiology in our brains.
Yeah, neurobiology and the environments in which neurobiology occurs. Yeah, it's an emergent property of things that aren't in themselves essentially psychological. And this, I suppose, this sort of ties in the supernatural with some kind of idea of animism as well. That one of the features of the supernatural, it tends to be some kind of form of animism. Sorry, Christopher, did I cut across you there?
No, that's okay. I just think that it's being demonstrated how colloquially, the way that we talk about things casually, nature seems obvious. It's like, it's what exists outside of my skin that I experience, or it's everything that's in the universe, right? Those answers fall flat as soon as you try to use them to move forward with, you know, a technical discussion about methodological naturalism, because, hey, some people experience revelation from their perspective, so that kind of takes the experience component out, and everything that's in the universe, of course, people who are of religious or theistic bends would say, well, God is part of the universe, so he's included in that too. So it makes it really difficult. On top of that, what makes it difficult is we have moved into such a theoretical, abstract version of science as compared to its origins as what used to be called natural philosophy, which kind of told you what kind of philosophy it was. It was philosophy about nature, as they understood it then. It's a little bit more difficult than it seems to just define what nature is, and I think that once we determine that and distinguish methodological from philosophical naturalism, then we have to determine whether or not it really is an axiom in science.
Yeah. I think that is the issue. Is it? I mean, I don't know what this person. I mean, we're sort of talking about somebody on their behalf here, aren't we? But I don't know what they meant by a flawed axiom in science. I mean, myself, I wouldn't, as a philosopher, I wouldn't initially say that it is a flawed axiom in science, because I don't think it's any kind of axiom in science. Most philosophers, when we talk about metaphysical naturalism, are talking about an idea that science and philosophy are in some way continuous, so there's a continuity between them. There's no proper distinction between the practice of the one and the other. I think it's only within the context of certain kinds of apologetics and response to apologetics that the issue becomes one of whether science is, there's a brute commitment in science to natural causation or not. I think that's actually rather a specialised debate within the broader context of methodological naturalism.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Gary, but I think that methodological naturalism, the way that it's practiced now, is left over from the natural philosophers. They had that as part of their restrictions of how they could provide explanations, whether they used induction or deduction or whatever. You know, even though a lot of the people that are popularized what we call modern science were theists, and they had their religious ideas, they didn't let that bleed into their explanations for, you know, F equals ma, or, you know, like.
And there became a point where there was a definite sense of isolationism grew up, where you were definitely not supposed to do that. That became implicit in the idea of methodological naturalism, that kind of isolationism, that kind of there's this and there's that, and the two things won't, you know, they have nothing to say about each other really, the MoMA thing. But that's come under question recently, and I certainly take a more provisional view of methodological naturalism. I think of the 5 or so arguments for that kind of implicit isolation, which are off the top of my head. I think there's arguments from definition, arguments from natural laws, and there's the Pennock thing, the science stopper, and there's 2 others as well, I think, which are more methodological. I don't think any of those establish that point that there is an in principle block to science studying the supernatural. And
well, that's you say that, but I mean, you say in principle, but people are actually doing this. In psychology, there's been an increase in investigation of parapsychology. Notably, the parapsychology unit up in Edinburgh, a well-founded and well-respected parapsychology unit. I mean, I think there's one in the University of Northumbria.
Yeah. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the 50s, wasn't the American Parapsychology Association accepted within the American Psychological Society? Even if it was only temporarily.
There's interesting Cold War stories behind that.
Please tell.
Well, there was research in parapsychology. If it is a genuine phenomenon, it obviously has intelligence benefits. And that's where much of the funding and the interest in parapsychology came from during those years of the Cold War.
Oh yeah, I mean, oh okay, so you get these remote viewer type people.
Sure.
Being one aspect of the the um, the parapsychology aspect. Hello, Fiona.
Yeah.
There's Fee.
Fiona.
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah, but yeah, so parapsychology, if people are studying parapsychology, that would be more sort of consistent with a sort of a provisional methodological naturalism than a sort of in principle intrinsic methodological naturalism.
Yes, because I was reading some of the definitions of methodological naturalism, and they really come out to me as saying these are the methods we have for studying nature as we know it, using the natural laws. So experiment, things like that, and data analysis of experiments, and the drawing unique conclusions, or at least coming up with some more questions to ask.
Yeah. Now the thing is, what is interesting is the criticisms that I believe this people like Bissell, I assume, but if he's saying the things that say Plantinga is saying, I'm not sure they apply if there's a more willingness to accept methodological naturalism provisionally rather than in principle, because I think often what apologists are doing is they're making a rhetorical play whereby they can paint scientists as dogmatic, because scientists appear to be dismissing supernatural causation either dogmatically or on the basis of poor arguments, like the standard 5 arguments against.
Gary, Chris, you had said something about this when you were on my show, right? You had mentioned talking about the accepting provisionally methodological naturalism, and I think that you said something to the effect of like, hey, science doesn't restrict it. If you can find a methodological supernatural method by which to move science forward, go for it. That would be awesome. It would be a revolution.
You'd have to work. You have to arrange these things at distance from where you are, given the success of methodological naturalism so far. But ultimately, there's no in principle reason why the supernatural explanation couldn't be the one to go for scientifically. It's it's not a reason in principle. It's a practical reason ultimately, but it's not a reason in principle.
Yeah, I mean, so certainly as scientists, I expect my explanations or theories in the sort of things which I use to be able to explain and predict outcomes of future experiments. And when you have that criteria for your theory, then if the supernatural is a psychological, intent-driven phenomenon, then it's not possible to predict the outcome of something which is inherently almost got a personality.
Well, this is memorialized in a really popular meme that happens every year, right? Where it says, here is a list of creation science's breakthrough contributions to science, and there's nothing under it.
Yeah, I mean, this is
worked out a methodological supernaturalism. They would be kicking ass.
Yeah, but it's not that it's impossible in principle. It's just that it's a very distant possibility, and that's a significant difference in terms of the way that scientific commitments to methodological naturalism are used to portray scientists as being dogmatic.
Now, as far as the dogma goes, I'd like to address that really quick, because based on some of the readings and lectures that I've been involved with, Thomas Kuhn's paradigmatic theory, he pretty much readily admits that there is a quasi-dogmatic phase during normal science where things are just accepted because we kept trying to refute the basic principles under which we're assuming no work would get done. We would just spend all of our time trying to prove that our assumptions are right and not move forward or have any progress.
Sure. Yeah. That'd be impractical.
That's a legitimate when people say that scientists are dogmatic, that's fine and well, but even through all of these historical paradigm shifts that have occurred, the principle of methodological naturalism, even if that's not what it was called, seems to be a thread of continuity through it.
Fiona, do you want to talk about your methodological supernaturalism?
Yes, in previous conversations on this, I've always pointed out that if you are going to form a hypothesis which brings in the supernatural, then how are you going to test that hypothesis, and how are you going to set up your positive and negative controls? And then someone gave me what they called was an example of going outside of methodological naturalism, and they said that the example proved that methodological supernaturalism was feasible. And the example given was that in the desert there is a rock with a big crack in it, and that's evidence of where Moses hit the rock and the water came out. And that is how you can bring methodological supernaturalism.
I don't think they've produced a particularly convincing case there.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so at all. But I think that's maybe illustrates the problem, in that you can't formulate a hypothesis that brings in the supernatural and then test it, because we don't have a woo detector. Not yet. You build me one, I will use it.
And I guess this, again, it's coming back to effectively what Fiona said. It's how can we test for the supernatural? How can we test if something has a personal intent behind it?
Yeah, because why wouldn't you just be able to pose that if there is at least one mind responsible for this, giving it intent, why wouldn't there be many? Then how could we test between them?
Mm-hmm.
That which one is correct, or that any of them are correct?
Yes, and you're right, Chris, and it's questions like these that really put a stopper on moving forward, to actually finding out more about the phenomena.
Yeah, I mean,
the problem though with the argument from procedural necessity, which I think this is that it's not going to be particularly surprising that you can't test for it if you're excluding it in the first place.
But I don't think science is excluding it, though. Basically what science is saying is we can't touch it. We've got no methodology by which we can.
Well, how do we touch the things we do touch, and why is that methodology unextendable to supernatural cases?
I think because we haven't. I mean, there have been some investigations done into the supernatural. You touched on it earlier, but what you're detecting at the end of it is a physical effect, a natural effect, whether it be all the threads strung from the ceiling blowing in the same direction, or a sudden temperature drop, or a sudden temperature increase. We haven't got a way to measure outside of the natural, to actually detect.
But when we do,
you think about it this way: in the days before Geiger counters, and we couldn't detect radioactivity. So how would we be able to work out the role that played in anything that we observed?
Yeah, this is the testability argument.
It is, and it's difficult if you can't test the hypothesis that you formulated.
Yeah.
Then you're stuck with an untested hypothesis.
Now,
if somebody builds the woo detector, science would use it.
And there's also another question which you can ask. Suppose you do get some sort of supernatural event happening, and it somehow suspends the usual natural laws that we're used to. do we put that down as perhaps some natural phenomena that we don't know about, or just experimental error? These are also some questions that you have to ask when you get these sort of things going on.
But I think the thing is that, I mean, part of this is to do with we want to make our science immune to kind of spurious defences of ridiculous hypotheses, for example. This is the immunity problem. We want to do that, certainly, but do we have to rule out supernatural explanations in principle to be able to do that? Or do we just have to remove them to a distant possibility? Will that suffice?
Well, so it's pragmatic. It sounds like.
Yeah, it's pragmatic and provisional approach to our denial of supernatural causation, rather than just sort of slapping our hands together and making a philosophical fiat that no, if it's supernatural, it's not. It's like a perpetual motion machine. We're not even going to admit it for research or analysis. I mean, you know, that's because I think that's the question. Because as I said earlier, to me, this issue comes from a particularly local dispute between apologists and scientists, and I think in the context of that dispute, the important point is whether we are methodological naturalists in principle or just pragmatically.
Yeah, and I don't think it's to do with excluding the supernatural, but it's to do with only including that which we can actually do.
Right, but because we make all kinds when we do sort of predict and explain empirical phenomena using theories. Of course, we posit all kinds of things in those theories that are not directly observable. Yeah, and can seem quite alien and counterintuitive from a common sense point of view. But we posit them and put them in our theories anyway because they're very effective at giving us testing the hypothesis and giving us the best predictions and the best explanations. You could argue that it's a distant possibility that the supernatural, the fundamentally intentional, could be included in those theories, could be posited in our best empirical theories. It just doesn't tend to work. There's examples of it. So
as I explained before, Gary, when you look at supernatural explanations, there's no way to add that into your empirical model. All you have for empirical models are basically curve fits of data. And there's no way really to actually say, okay, this is my curve fit, my data. I've got some sort of supernatural thing going on here, so this is what I have to do. There's nothing in mathematics yet or psychology to be able to do that.
Is that the case in principle? Is there any sort of in principle reason for that to be the case? You know, or is it just a case that we've found practically that doing that doesn't do the job?
I don't think in principle you can just account for some psychological reasoning for some data being why it's like that. Some being wanted it to be like that one particular day, some supernatural being that can perhaps suspend our current laws of motion, current laws of physics as we know it, and we get this particular data set.
That would obviously apply much more to physics than it would to psychology, though, wouldn't it?
Because yeah, I mean, well, I'm not talking about hard sciences. I'm talking about physics, chemistry, and biology. So whenever you get some data in those sciences, and you have to think about, is there a supernatural cause behind it? You can't take into account this. You take into account of psychology of something which you don't know, and you can't. I don't think you can actually take out anything about the supernatural from a set of numerical data, because surely the supernatural entity can change it from day from time point to time.
Sure, it could do, or it might not. it might maintain those law-like relations as it might be their author, and they might be there as part of its intention. It's a psychological entity, and it can do whatever it wants.
So in that case, what you've said is that it could be the case that we cannot distinguish the natural from the supernatural.
Well, we can, because if our best empirical theories, the substantial posits of our best empirical theories are not non-intentional, then we're in the natural realm. If the substantial posits of our best empirical theories are intentional, then we're in the supernatural realm.
Yeah, but you just said if that intention of that supernatural being, for example, is to keep those laws constant for all time, then we cannot distinguish natural from supernatural, because with the natural we would expect a certain phenomena to be the same for all place and all time. But if a supernatural being is making a phenomena be like that, then it's difficult to distinguish the natural from the supernatural, and you've got a whole muddle there.
I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, for one thing, I think in the Christian tradition, in the main, the idea is that the natural world is contingent, and its creator is necessary. That's generally the way they see things. And I don't know why it would be impossible to distinguish between the natural and the supernatural. I don't get what you mean there.
Well, only the case where the supernatural being makes a certain set of phenomena constant throughout time, meaning they are the same.
Mm-hmm.
So when we test it once, we test it again, we get the same sort of idea.
Yeah, there could be universal law-like regularities.
Yes,
yeah?
yes.
Okay.
So you've got the natural, which would automatically lead to a universal law-like regularity, and also this supernatural entity making a phenomena universal, regular, and all this sort of thing. So you've got one fixed law, say gravitation, for example, and two possible explanations. One is a supernatural being which makes it constant for all time, and another explanation is, well, it's constant because of, I don't know, mass attraction between planets and all this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Some physical constant.
Yes, some physical constants like that.
Sure. But surely you decide which one is you posit as your substantial content of your theory on the basis of the effectiveness of the theory.
Yes, but the theory you get from the empirical data you get will be the same. So you can. So I guess what the apologists are saying is you can do either. Their supernatural being makes the law regular, and then, or you can have some sort of natural phenomena like, I don't know, gravity being like, because there are masses in the universe, there's energy momentum,
sure,
get a gravitational attraction. But but the natural law is quite a simple thing to work with. If you say go with the supernatural explanation, then you have to ask, why is it keeping the law universal,
sure,
regular? And if you go down that track, you can tie yourself up in all kinds of knots, and that won't actually help you understand.
I'd agree with that, but perhaps what I'd say is that in doing that, you found good practical reasons not to adopt supernatural.
Oh yeah.
At least, but they're not reasons. They're not reasons why in some distant, more remote testing situation. So there's no distant possibility. There is a distant possibility that it still could be supernatural. It's just that we don't get there. I think what condemns the supernatural isn't that it's impossible in principle. It's just that in practice it doesn't explain. It's such hard work and yields very little. But it's not that it's in principle impossible. And I think that's the key distinction as I see it in the debate.
And let's not deny the fact that people that lob the methodological naturalism against science as if it is evidence of them being dogmatic, what they're really saying is it's not methodological naturalism. You're not doing it for pragmatic reasons. It's really allowing a wedge for philosophical naturalism to work its way into science, and therefore, by being a philosophical naturalist, they would say you reject supernatural, so you're just begging the question that all there is nature.
This is precisely where they're coming from with the wedge doctrine.
And for those that don't know what the wedge doctrine is, I know Fiona does. This is a document that was put out by the Discovery Institute, who are intelligent design proponents. Fiona, your mic is muted.
It goes way back, and it was just as ID was beginning to sort of pick up, and it was a way to put God back into science, and the wedge document describes that is actually what they were trying to do, and it was to get it back into science education at the school level. And so I think one of the difficulties, and given the discussion that there has been tonight, is that we are forgetting that when the attack on methodological naturalism is happening, a lot of it is to do with what we teach children in science class. And the argument is that we shouldn't be teaching them that methodological naturalism is the method that science uses, and that they should be taught to use an alternative method.
Yeah.
And it brings me into my wee pea plant thing that I mentioned. If I do an experiment and I plant up 10 wee pea plants, and 5 of those plants I add fertilizer, and 5 of them I don't, and then I let them grow on, and then I measure the difference in the size of the plants, and I discover that the 5 that have been given fertilizer are bigger and stronger. Now it's at this point that the request is being made to not stick with methodological naturalism to explain that result.
Mm-hmm.
If I use methodological naturalism, I would say the fertilizer has caused them to grow bigger and stronger. If I want to try and include the supernatural in that, and I formulate this idea of why these 5 have grown bigger and stronger than the others, how do I explain it? Am I going to say, well, that supreme being preferred those 5 peas when I planted them? And if I come up with that, how do I test it then?
Yeah.
Because if I say it must be the fertilizer that did it.
And how do you address the strong correlation that you physically added fertilizer to the ones that got bigger and stronger?
Exactly. And I mean, that's the level of science that we're teaching at schools. And how confusing is it going to be when you say when children look at this and they know they added the fertilizer to one set of 5 and they grew bigger. If you turn around and say, oh, and by the way, the logic that you've used to say, well, the fertilizer must have caused them to grow bigger, that could be wrong because it could be a supreme being just preferred those 5 peas.
They'd probably say something along the lines of, look, children, isn't it great how God made carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen atoms friendly to plants? This is God's plan. This is what God... It'd be an unnecessary addition to God at any step of the stage. So there'd always be something there that this is God's plan, this is part of God's plan, this is, there'd be a theological thing. The way they want to get that into schools, though, is by saying, but look, people who rule that out are just being dogmatic, and we shouldn't have dogma in the classroom. Teach the controversy, it all comes back down to this thing of portraying the scientists as being dogmatic.
Yeah, this is something. I've emphasised it so many times. It's not that science says we refuse to touch the supernatural. Science says we can't. We've got no way of doing it.
Yeah, but that's very much like don't touch the supernatural. It amounts to the same thing practically. It amounts to us saying, look, this is just impossible. This has nothing to do with us. So, no, we're just doing this instead. And that can be twisted as well. It's like, look, you're ruling it out in principle, and that's the problem.
Yeah, it can be twisted. I can go on about my bakery class, where you learn to bake brilliant Victoria sponges. But they taught me nothing about how to make a wrought iron gate. And that doesn't mean that wrought iron gates don't exist. It's just that in my bakery class, I didn't have the equipment to make a wrought iron gate, but I did have the equipment to make a good Victoria sandwich. And that's the only distinction. That's how simple the distinction is. I don't have the equipment to do it. Give me the equipment I can use at the bench, and I'll use it.
There's no reason why, in principle, scientists can't have equipment that could, as a distant possibility, posit supernatural causes.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But it's different. That's. I think we're getting onto something else, because if we follow the scientific method as it's currently understood, depending on what field you're in, right? And we come up with a conclusion that we think we have an answer for, in addition to the answer, it's depending on how you made the experiment, what your procedure is and method. At the end, to say, oh well, it seems that this is what's causing this, and then to additionally interject or inject into that, but it could also be God.
Yeah.
Right?
This is God's plan.
Yeah. And that kind of violates the law of parsimony to a certain extent, because like you're injecting it. You're adding.
That would be a really good reason not to do that offhand, or nowhere near as immediately as these intelligent design creationist people want to. All we have to do is make sure we don't come across as being dogmatic by seeming to rule it out in principle in advance. And if we do that, we've counteracted this apologetic tactic.
Yeah, but the problem is that they have decided that it is de facto ruled out because of ideology, rather than because of the lack of methodology. So they see it as science just arrogantly saying there is no supernatural, rather than science saying this is our limit, we can't go any further at the moment. And
science was able to account for the supernatural. Don't you think that would be so specialized? It would almost need to be its own thing. Like an argument I've made in the past, and I might change my position on it, but it's the very picture, my very avatar is why football bat. It's my football bat analogy. Hey, football is what it is. Let's consider science football. Let's consider things that are studying supernature, baseball. Well, guess what? There's no such thing as a football bat. If you want to swing at the football with a baseball bat, in other words, interject supernatural explanations to already resilient theories that are based on nature, then you're engaging in football bat mentality. And I think why don't you just start something else, pursue what you want, and stop trying to change the juggernaut that is modern science based on natural philosophy.
That's a fair point, and I think people are trying to do that with parapsychology. As I said, to bring it back to the start of the podcast, the first thing that we spoke about science moving in to the supernatural, to investigating the supernatural realm, so to speak, is the parapsychology unit up in Edinburgh, studying something called the psi field. Now, that has no idea.
I'm laughing so hard right now. I was muted, but I wanted to unmute myself to laugh at Seifield.
Seifield. Can you be sure of it?
I have no idea. But it's something which they enlist on their research interests. So that to me means that they're trying to use methodological naturalism to study the supernatural, and so what does their underlying methodology mean? Does it make sense to do that?
You'd have to define science.
Yeah, well, not exactly. I think you'd have to understand what type of experiments they're doing, what type of data they're getting,
sure,
and how they're analysing that data.
Mm. And what way of doing that falls in the remit of science, and which perhaps doesn't.
Yeah, and I mean, how do they measure anything? They can only measure those physical effects, because they cannot measure the supernatural input.
Yes.
Sure, but they can posit the supernatural on the basis of a predicting and explaining the observations they make.
I don't know if parapsychology is such a good example, because wouldn't they say that the psi energy field is natural? It falls outside of how we understand nature now.
Yeah.
But if they could first show a robust effect that there are consequences to the psi field that we can predict. Okay, then we can kind of tacitly assume that it exists, and from there get deeper into what exactly it is. I don't know how far they are in researching parapsychology or the psi field, but they would first need to show that it exists robustly.
But the problem is this, though, that because the measurements that they do are things like, well, let's for example say how many of those cards they get right, or as I said before, temperature change or whatever, and they are measuring those physical things that they can measure. But what they can't do is determine how many kilowoo it took.
Kilowoo.
What happens if you
Kilowoo.
what happens if you drop the kilowoo by 50%, or increase it by 50%? And how do you stop the kilowoo from affecting your negative control? And how are you going to manage to put the right amount of kilowoo into your positive control? You see, because that's one of the things that you would need to control within the experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't. I mean, what is a kilowoo in volt equivalence?
Well, does it fit into? You could ask: does it have a volt equivalent, or is it something that's, more fundamental? Is the psychological factor something that's more fundamental than the physical factors? Which is what the supernaturalists would want. They might say, well, look, they might start making rather unfortunate, perhaps, references to quantum wave phenomena and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
But then you're right. There comes the question of testability.
Yes.
But and it is difficult for them. It is difficult for them, and that's why methodological naturalism. It's not. I don't think it's an axiom in science, but it's damn useful if you want to do useful science.
Yeah. There was an experiment done trying to investigate the effect of supernatural. It was a prayer experiment.
Yeah, intercessionary prayer. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was 3 groups of post-cardiac surgery patients, and one group was prayed for and knew they were being prayed for.
Mm-hmm.
Second group were prayed for and didn't know they were being prayed for, and the third group weren't prayed for at all. And they wanted to see if there was a difference in outcome, and there was. But paradoxically, they discovered that the group that did worst when it came to post-op complications was the group that was prayed for and knew they were being prayed for.
Yeah.
And they think it was a psychological effect that knowing that they were being prayed for made them more worried.
Yeah.
And so, that was a really quite praiseworthy attempt to look at something like that. I mean, they did set up the groups quite well.
Mm.
They just didn't get the result they expected.
No, well, they didn't get the result perhaps some people would have wanted. And I would say it's the continual repetition of that state of affairs that is the strongest case for methodological naturalism.
And I was just thinking, Fiona is very much seems to be echoing my opinion here. I think because we're both scientists, we come at these things the same way. One thing in science is we try and, with our experiments, only change one parameter at a time. So if we're positing an experiment which could potentially investigate the supernatural, how can we control that experiment enough to possibly limit the supernatural being's ability to change all other variables and just work on one variable, so we can work out how that.
Well, how do you do it with natural variables? How do you do it with natural variables?
Well, I mean, given the experiment, it's a case of if you're seeing how pressure varies with volume in an ideal gas, you make sure that the temperature is constant.
And you can measure that?
Yes. So it's these sort of things that you think about. I mean, with gases, you've only got three things to worry about. You've got density, you've got pressure, and you have temperature. Right? So to see how one changes with respect to another, you have to.
But in order to suss out what you're talking about for natural variables, for supernatural variables, you'd essentially need to reinvent the wheel, and then that brings us, if we want to step outside of science into like the meta science, which is how science gets funded. What is worth putting money towards? Is it worth right now? Is there a necessity to look into supernatural causes for anything, considering how robust the scientific method is, the model that we're using currently is? I mean, let's face it, there's more money being thrown at research and development for erectile dysfunction than there is for like really awesome basic science questions already. So there's a
rich white male medicine, rich white middle-aged male medicine is very profitable.
Yes.
I think that's the main question. And I mentioned controls before. Somebody that I work beside designed an experiment, and their experimental design was like a work of art. And they were using a microtiter plate, a 128 well plate. So it's the equivalent of 128 little test tubes. One single well was the experiment, and all the other wells in it were controls. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen.
Nice.
And you're able to measure what's happened in those controls.
Yeah.
And with Matthew's example, you can keep an eye on the actual temperature during the experiment. How do I keep an eye on the amount of kilowoo in my negative control during my experiment on the effect of woo on whatever it is I'm studying? I can't measure that for my negative control. And if I can't have a negative control, then the experiment is completely invalid.
Yeah.
And that's a real difficulty.
But
How
it's
do you do that?
You're going back to the idea that there is no metric for supernatural, right?
We don't have one yet. That's what I'm saying.
That's exactly the point. And this goes back to what we said originally is from a pragmatic sense, since we don't have a metric for the supernatural, it's a fly in the ointment, because if we did have that metric, we can measure the control such that we can say that, hey, no woo occurred in the controls, but it did occur in the experimental variable.
Yeah.
Right?
That's the problem.
Yeah.
So, real quick, if you don't mind, I'd like to address some of the comments that are being made in the comment section under the video, because they're really good ones. So, first of all, we have John F. McDropout. Thank you very much for watching, John. Question to the panel. Aren't all axioms in science provisional because of the requirement for peer corroboration in the presentation of data? He has other questions, but let's start with that. From my opinion, based on what you said earlier, Gary, saying that it's an axiom in science in and of itself sets up an improperly formed question. Right?
Yeah, it makes it seem very like it's a brute fact, and that is rather suspicious when people start trying to hide behind basic beliefs and presuppositions.
Okay, so then he asks a follow-up question. Doesn't the unavailability of demonstration of the supernatural, what Fiona was talking about, to everyone, anyone, make this presentation impossible, presentation of the data for supernatural, and therefore render the data useless for anyone but the direct observer?
I'd say it doesn't. No, I'd say it doesn't make it impossible, because these things for measurements, the way what the measurements are conducted in, is they're nested within theories and auxiliary hypotheses that work together to allow you to design your experiments to test the variables independently. And it's not impossible for those theories and that nesting of theories to be organized such so that you can, in principle, test for supernatural posits. It's just incredibly impractical given the track record up to date.
Now, he has one more follow-up statement that I think really hones in on what he's curious. I think that he's more focused on the peer review process of the scientific method than anything else, because then he says this, cart before the horse perhaps, but the important part seems to be the need for peer review in order to maintain the bias filter of the requirement for demonstration.
There is a need for peer review, but there's obviously a need for a whole range of methodologies that we need in order to use science to warrant our beliefs. So yeah, peer review is in there, but it's not. It's necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition for good science.
Mm-hmm. And so I want to kind of riff off of that for a quick second. So in addition to people, I want to say anti-science, but they're not. Or people that are anti-methodological naturalism. They will sometimes also use scientific studies that have been peer-reviewed and published, that are legitimate, that the authors claim are caused by X, and they'll be like, no, that's proof of God. That's proof of an intelligent designer. So I think that that's a weird move, because it's not that people can't demonstrate that there is supernatural according to them. It's that you are demonstrating it with these studies in science that are using methodological naturalism, but their explanations are incorrect, right? Like people like, and I'm gonna name names, like a Nephilim Free or a Tommy Hall. Love you guys both, but when you cherry pick certain bits of data that support supernatural from your perspective,
yeah,
and it flies in the face of the consensus of experts in the field based on the paradigm that we're using right now, anomalies don't equal refutation.
No, and people aren't at liberty to make kind of maverick kind of interpretations of scientific studies either. I mean, sure, make your case, but really expect to have the shit ripped out of you if you're gonna talk bollocks.
All right, so Heavy Hauler has a comment as well. He said, this might be way out in left field, but if everything in the universe was being held together and working by supernatural power, then there would be no cosmological constants, equations for magnetism, weak or strong forces, etc. would not make sense or relate in any way to each other.
I don't know. I can't see why. Why not?
I think this is kind of like the if he's responsible for all of them, they don't have to be consistent, but we're noticing these patterns that make them consistent.
Sure, but they don't have to be inconsistent either.
I agree.
Yeah. That's one of the things that I think, given that I'm the only theist here, and I'm not a young earth creationist, and I do accept evolution, and my whole, it's a faith part of it here, But my belief in the start of everything is God put the basic laws of physics in place, lit the blue touch paper, and stood well back.
Mhm.
And those basic laws of physics would give you the various constants. But again, it's a position of faith. But I mean, that position that I take doesn't mean that the constants would actually end up being variables or variable in any way, shape, or form. So no, I don't think it would need to be. But as I say, that's faith. That's just purely in faith and nothing else. But just
No, it's a reasonable position to take. There doesn't seem to be anything in the idea of a constant that makes it necessarily natural.
Yeah, because patterns that we observe in the past have been shown to change under different circumstances. You know, so it's. I think it's the intellectually honest position of people who do understand the scientific method and use it appropriately when talking about things in a discussion that it's provisional. It's a best fit. Theories using methodological naturalism, which pragmatically seems to work, even though there is a small probability that supernatural variables might have a play in it. It is the natural explanations that provide the best explanation and predictive power according to current instruments that are being able to be that are used, the history of theories that have come before us, and the data that exists.
Sure, but that's the position that I take, and I think it's the position many of us here take. But it's not the position, for example, that Michael Ruse would take, or it's not the position in the Kitzmiller versus Dover case, or the sort of what the American Institute of Science take. They take a different view. They take that science and metaphysics are isolated from each other. So. It's not a widely held view that methodological naturalism is provisional. There are many, and there are political reasons why they do it, why people hold it to be an intrinsic distinction.
I mean, I can quite clearly see that philosophical naturalism is a subset of methodological naturalism, and I mean, speaking as an atheist, my philosophical naturalism fits quite happily into methodological naturalism, and when I do science, I'm not contradicting my own point of view, and I'm not doing bad science either, because to quote Lawrence Krauss, every scientist is a functional atheist when they enter the lab. Meaning that everyone has to certainly try and adhere to trying to actually come up with a natural explanation, not saying that it was done by this particular supernatural being, and then say da 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 da. Most, if not all, scientists, certainly of the hard variety, actually have to use some data daily in their actual research to come up. And when you think of, okay, perhaps this data is a mixture of natural and supernatural, how can I break apart these two bits of data to analyze the amount of pascals of this and the amount of kilowoo on this that gives this sort of pascal? So there's, even intrinsically, you cannot break them apart. You have to consider the thing as a whole. And as scientists, we think about talk about accuracy to the number of decimal places. I mean, experimental physicists do this to some.
As an experimental physicist, you win on that account.
I don't do it. I don't do experiments. They don't let me in the lab. I break things. But it really is just a matter of when we're talking about our theories, it's how closely can we match our theory to what our experiment tells us. for example, calculating the I don't know the wave profiles of the incoming waves on the beach. For example, this is a physical problem which actually was part of my PhD thesis. It's quite easy to set up a problem. It's quite easy to derive a profile for the wave and check
How
it.
coincidental you choose that as an example, Dr. Hunt.
It's a nice simple experiment because you can see the profile and you can compare two on top of the other just to see one, if the actual shape is correct, and two, if there's a scaling issue or anything like that. So that sort of thing, or anything, temperature of the core of the sun, for example. It's these sort of things. It's when you're measuring these, how can you use supernatural? How can you use methodological supernaturalism to actually measure these two things?
Well, how do you do it in terms of natural causes?
Well, you know the sort of things which are involved in the sun. You've got fusion. You've got gravity,
But
pressure.
you have those things on the basis of a number of auxiliary hypotheses, of background hypotheses and theories that are already tested, and that which you or maybe not, but you'll adopt them and use them and assume that they're correct in order to organise your particular piece of the picture.
That's quite a good question to ask. So let me try and answer it. So what we have in science is we get these laws, say Bernoulli's equation in fluid dynamics. We can try and apply this to the sun. Well, how do we know that it applies to the sun? Well, we can look at scales, for example. We can do a scaling analysis on this and see if the sort of thing scales up or scales down appropriately. We can look at the type of phenomena that we observe on the sun. We observe fluid behavior. We observe magnetic coronal loops, all this sort of thing, and we know. And then what we do, we test these sort of things elsewhere very rigorously, and separately they work very well. So then we say, let's bolt these things together, clunk. Let's see what they predict. Let's see what we observe. So again, just like science, we have two very good theories, fluid dynamics and electromagnetism. We stick them together and see what they produce and what sort of things they predict, and then we go looking for these things on the sun, for example.
Yeah, so it's like it's almost like an interdisciplinary web.
Yes, and this is possibly one of the difficulties with falsification of such models, because they're built up of several submodels, and those submodels may have some empirical data fitted to them to get so you've got your submodels, for example. Then you've got this interrelated web of all these sort of things which may or may not include some empirical data and all this sort of stuff, and then you fix them together and it doesn't work. Do you say everything's wrong, or do you say, oh, just this bit in this model?
Well, you have to go into heuristic mode, and that's where you have to start engineering bits of the webs, tweaking and seeing which you think is more likely, which is in itself a process that takes part in a wider set of theories, and that's heuristics mode. And I think that's
what you're talking about right now are legitimate discussions about how science proceeds, right? When we restrict arguments against science as, well, it uses methodological naturalism and I don't want it to, well then that's not sharpening the blade of science as an instrument. It's just using that knife as a coffee table leg. You're just using it for a completely different purpose. Like, there are legitimate arguments within science. How does evidence really support theory?
Yeah.
Does science provide reality or knowledge of reality or not? Is there an ontological component to science? These, I think, are the things that start to freak them out because that's what they're seeing down the line. But they're addressing this in the short term so that they can reject those kinds of arguments in the long term. But those are legitimate arguments within science about how do we know that we're not begging the question because our instruments are theory laden to begin with because, you know, like all of that, like everything is theory laden. And the theory happens to work on non-supernatural variables. Well, they just want to take a wedge, they want to take a crowbar to that, and the input is methodological naturalism.
So what you're talking about, effectively, Chris, is what we call in applied mathematics inverse problems. So we've got this data. How do we go back to get information about the actual physics? And this has to be done via the glasses of whatever physical theory or chemical theory or biological theory that you're working with. And it's very hard to answer because the results you get are exceedingly theory dependent.
Sure. Yeah.
You use a different model to go back to the original. You've got this, say, you're doing a scattering, particle scattering. You've got all this scattering data. How can you go back to go to the original particle? That's a difficult problem. If your theory is wrong, you're going to get back to the wrong set of particles and conclude the wrong thing.
You're testing your theories, aren't you? That's what you're doing. You're testing a hypothesis. You have a hypothesis. You theorize it. It's mathematically formulated in your case, and it has causal elements in it. You're testing that theory. You're putting it to the test, and you're trying to see which one's best. Usually, you know, there's some competing theories. I've got this one in hand. I'm going to test this one to see which one's best. If that's how it proceeds, then all we need to admit in order to diffuse the threat of the anti-methodological naturalist is say, well, look, I'm not ruling out in principle that there's a theory that could have supernatural posits in it, causal relations that come from supernatural things. I'm not ruling it out in principle, but you know, like Christopher says. Hell, am I going to get funding for it? No. Is it going to be easy to do? No. So it's a long way off. You know, there's a lot of naturalistic theories you have to work your way through in your you know, before you get to the supernatural ones.
Yeah, that's very true.
That's a good point.
And also, you remember that science is tentative anyway.
Yeah, and it's tentative in its philosophical presumptions as well.
Because you are stating that your conclusions hold if X and Y and Z are as you have stated them. So you're not ruling out the fact that those conclusions could change if X or Y or Z were different.
A supernatural posit. There could be your best theory could theoretically be be one with supernatural posits in.
Yeah.
And as long as you admit that, that's fine. You're not. It doesn't mean you have to investigate every piece of tomfoolery, spooky dookiness that comes along.
Yeah, but you can only draw the conclusions based on the data that you have.
Sure.
And you have to be so careful not to go outside that.
But this also comes down to, once again, the intellectual honesty of the I don't know within science, right? There might be anomalies. Once again, anomalies are not refutations. There might be unexplained phenomena. There might be questions within your model that you have yet to answer.
If there wasn't, science would be so boring.
What's that?
If there wasn't, science would be so boring.
Oh, exactly. Thank goodness all of these things exist, all these questions exist, because hopefully they can be answered. But I mean, I think that is missing from the people that are once again not anti-science but anti-methodological naturalists or naturalismists. That's what they're missing. And I'm generalizing, of course. It's that humble sense of humility that we don't know, and we're going to reserve having an opinion about it until we can explore it further. I think that they want to take that same model and be like, no, don't leave it unanswered. There must be certainty and absolute and universal necessary certainty in our knowledge. And it's like, no, well, it's provisional. It's going to change. Things have changed drastically. Non-Euclidean geometry blew everybody's mind because for thousands of years, Euclidean geometry was the only model, and it was worked out deductively, and people thought that that made perfect sense.
Mm. There's the people who want to know and the people who want to be right, and those aren't the same thing.
Awesome point.
Yeah. The other thing that has always struck me as very strange is I think scientists are scientists because they're inherently nosy people. You know, they just cannot keep their beak out of it. And they want to find things out. And they are not going to deliberately lead themselves up the garden path. Because given that each step is dependent on the previous steps, who's going to fudge their data so that the next step then fails?
Mm.
If you are one of these nosy people that wants to just understand the nuts and bolts of it, why would you lie to yourself and use this, air quotes, false methodology?
Because you know where you want to go already. You've got your desire to be in a particular place.
Either that, or there is a presupposition. Like, see what I did there? There is a presupposition that that there has to, there are many curious theists that don't know much about science, but they're pursuing truth with a capital T, knowledge with a capital K, and that's not what science does. Like, once again, you're using the wrong instrument.
Yeah.
So why do you football that? That's all I got to say.
But no, I think the whole thing comes down. I mean, I think the honesty of scientists is based in the fact that they are just downright nosy.
Yeah.
And so they're not going to fool themselves. Because I know that's why I did it. I really couldn't keep my nose out.
It's curiosity. It's a burning curiosity.
I don't even give it a Sunday name like that. I just call it nosiness.
But if you're genuinely curious about something, you're not going to lie to yourself. You're not going to trip yourself up. If you really want to know, you're going to do what it takes to know.
Yeah, I mean, this, I can just tell a little bit of an anecdote. I've told this before, but the reason why I like psychology and got into it is I was a musician. I was in music school taking a psych course as an elective. And I had all of these questions, and I was trying to answer them. I was not a very good high school student, so I didn't, no AP courses for me. So I got the grades that I needed to get out so that I could chase tail and play bass for 6 hours a day, practice bass, right? So by the time I got to college, I had all these questions about things, and I went into like New Age, the 3 pillars of Zen, and I pursued all of these avenues to try to answer these questions, and I found them fruitless. And then I took the psychology course, and pardon the pun, but it's like the hand of God came down and touched me on the forehead and said, this is the way to answer the questions that you have. So I think it comes back to the curiosity component you were talking about, Gary. I was curious, how are people different from me? That blew my mind. Still,
thank goodness they are.
But how? How can I systematize these individual differences? Well, guess what? There's a field called psychology that does that very thing.
Yep.
And it's not about capital T truth or capital K knowledge or any of that horseshit.
No, it's about trustworthy belief, and I think that's pretty much it. You want the broadest definition of science I think I can give is that it's the pursuit of trustworthy belief. Yeah. Now, if you know you're lying to yourself, you know it isn't trustworthy, so it isn't science, is it?
Yeah. We used to do this daft thing when I was doing my PhD, when if your experiment went wrong and you didn't get the result that you wanted, what excuses could you make up that it had actually worked? And the best one ever was one little chap who worked in the virology lab, and his DNA band came out on his gel too small. So it meant he'd got the wrong fragment. So he had to think up an excuse as to why it was really the right fragment, but it was behaving as if it was the wrong fragment. And he decided that for some reason, the DNA mixture had been sorted by the pixies, who had then pushed it further down the gel than it was supposed to go, making it look as if it was smaller. But that only happened that happened every day of the week except on a Tuesday, when it was the yellow giraffes that pushed it further down the gel. And we gave him a prize for that one. Because we started off with quite sensible sort of excuses as to
But then
why
you just
it had
realise
gone
they
wrong.
might all be like that, yeah.
Yeah. It was actually a really good exercise in thinking at right angles.
Yeah.
To where you were going. It gave us lots of hilarious moments. And it resulted in the virology lab having jelly babies sellotaped all over it for some peculiar reason. But it was... what you had to do was try and convince others to accept this argument.
Okay, persuasion is a component in science, right? That's how you get grants.
Yeah, but it was a good mental exercise in trying to find something that was really ridiculous and make it sound sensible.
Yeah.
And we ended up, it was as if we honed our bullshit detectors.
Mm. Yeah, but by encouraging that creative thing as well, because creativity is an important part of science as well. Often people who don't like science think it's dead boring and dull and industrial and sort of, managerial and horror. And it isn't. It's actually a very creative part of the process. Is very creative. You have to have an imagination. You have to be able to sort of like, especially when you don't get the results you expect.
Yeah.
That's when you have to start going, right, what next?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I consider myself very fortunate. My boss comes up with basic ideas, and we have meetings with people to flesh out the question we want to answer, and then she just pretty much hands it to me, and I have to put meat on the bones of that idea and figure out what protocol, and this is where the creativity part comes in. What protocol, what method am I going to use to utilize these techniques, these instruments to get these endpoints to answer this research question? That is the most fun part of my job.
I think the creativity even comes in before that, when you have to think about the question you ask. Often in science, certainly in my experience, asking the right question can be key. Once you've asked the right question, then the solution is just a matter of just going through the algebra or the calculus or usual protocols. That's what I found is basically science. It's being able to ask the right question. When you're an undergraduate and postgraduate, you learn the techniques, you learn the principles, but when you're doing research, you really have to understand what question you ask.
Yeah,
I think that's more important, not more important. I think that's very important for you, Dr. Hunt, because of mathematics and the way that it is so deductive, where the question that you're asking based on the assumptions that you use, then you just do the hard science or working out the algebra, like you said. And the soft sciences, like me, the research question could be, can humans detect the difference between human stressed body odor, the body odor of somebody who is stressed, versus the body odor of someone who is not stressed? There are millions of ways to answer that question. How do you stress them? How do you collect the body odor? Do they do a washout period beforehand or not? All of these things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
you also have to do a conceptual analysis as well. You have to have some conception of what the ideas involved are, so you can structure the experiment to test it. So you're not starting in an entirely different place to what Matt's starting in, because he's doing kind of a mathematical physics thing. It's just that the way you go next isn't so. What Matt does is almost more like conceptual analysis, which is when you're doing mathematics and you do formal sciences, you are doing a kind of conceptual analysis, a formal conceptual analysis. But when you're doing it in, say, psychology, and you're doing it with terms that are a little softer and fuzzier, The next step, yeah, you're right. It's not as direct as just working through an algorithm.
Do you mind if I address some more comments under the video real quick?
Yeah, go on.
Okay. So Helena Handbasket is watching. Hello, Helena.
And Helena, I've had a shave. So I'm not so scruffy looking as she pointed out. I was in the Fundamentally Flawed podcast.
Well, good. I'm glad that she's keeping your landscaping in check.
Yeah, I did as well.
So she's asking whether or not, and you had addressed this, Matt. So, but for others to address on the panel, did they discuss the idea that were science to discover something supernatural, it would just conclude that that phenomenon wasn't supernatural after all? The phenomenon would simply be subsumed under what is natural. And you asked whether that had to do with Dawkins' reference to the paranormal. I think that's an interesting question, because what is considered nature and the natural laws that exist in modern science would have been scoffed at, I think, in the 17th century.
Mm. Don't
you think? Mm. Like, it would be seemed like you try talking about string theory, to somebody from the 17th, they'd be like, "What? That's metaphysics. That's exactly what we don't want in our science."
I certainly, speaking as a classical continuum mechanics person, the stuff I do would fit very, very nicely within the 17th century. It's when you're doing things like probabilistic things, like quantum mechanics, like string theory, which they would bulk at, because a lot of the stuff, I'll say all of it, comes from Newton's second law of motion, F equals ma.
Mm.
That's all I use in my work. I dress it up in terms of Euler equations, in terms of Navier-Stokes. I add other terms in which have come later, but at the core of my work, F equals ma.
Of course, in the 17th century, people didn't really there were people who didn't accept what Newton was saying, especially materialists, because they couldn't see how material atoms could account for sort of inverse distance laws and things like that. So it's it's not these things do change over time, and theories that pop up tend to not be accepted at first, including Newton's. There was a lot of people who thought Newton was speculating metaphysically about things that he couldn't possibly know on the basis of empirical observation.
Well, it flied in the face of the popular continental Cartesian model.
Yep, that's it. Yeah, kind of a res extensia model of material connection. Yeah.
It flied in the face?
Flew.
Flied?
Ooh, Fiona turned into the grammar Nazi at the drop of a dime.
No wonder, Mr. Mouty. Flied. Sorry, I do apologise, but I couldn't let that one go.
We're up to a stunning 18 viewers now, chaps.
That's epic.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it is. It is a question of going back to Helena's question on the paranormal. What we thought was perhaps supernatural. For example, magnetism was completely misunderstood or not understood back in Newton's day. Newton was mystified about it, but now we have a set of abstract laws to discuss how it works. But I think we have to go further, deeper into quantum electrodynamics to understand why these things are.
Sure, but one thing we should avoid doing, because again it makes us look dogmatic, is just classifying the natural as what scientists study, because then we're doing that self-fulfilling thing again, and it looks a bit shifty.
Yes. And kind of like what is IQ? It's what the IQ tests test.
Yeah, sure. That's not going to convince anybody. Like when, apologies Fiona, but when like theists, apologists sort of like try and convince you with ontological arguments that are just sort of like haven't really got any real content. They're not persuasive because they're just tautologies. Well, that's how we look when we just say the natural is what science studies. It doesn't make you look particularly sort of like adept.
But I really have to agree with Fiona on this when she said, as scientists, we look, what can we test? How can we test it? And when we come up to the supernatural, we just draw blank. It may be possible when we get more technology, but to be perfectly honest, I don't think so. I think science would always come up against the question: how can we test the supernatural? How can we get a decent definition? I mean, we've got a reasonable definition of what supernatural is, which we spoke about to begin with. So and then we say, how can we test? How can we control to get fixed points, fixed data points for the supernatural? And because of our definition, I don't think we can get a suitable set of data points or data points which we can test for in the experiment.
You just raised a question for me, like, for Christians that want to do away with methodological naturalism, do they not understand that even if scientists somehow are able to measure or show that there is anything supernatural, or that that a supernatural variable is a important part in explaining, predicting, and controlling, that it is a leap of logic to go from that thing that is extranatural, supernatural, non-natural, to the God of the Bible, so to speak, where they claim in no uncertain terms that he can do whatever he wants, within bounds, I guess, within some would say within certain logical. So the patternicity that we would require for it to be a science could be just circumvented by the fact that the supernatural variables that might in the future ever be shown theoretically with a small probability is tethered to the God of the Bible that they're saying is omnipotent and can kind of change things at will.
Yeah. Sure, but it's a start, and they need a start. They're desperate for a start. It's not. You're right. It doesn't follow, but it's a start, and it's a step in that direction that they feel they have to make. I think the main thing is though that there's a rhetorical opportunity to push a picture of their opponents as being dogmatic, and they make use of that.
I think maybe quite a lot of this can be laid at the door of the Dover trial.
Yeah, Kitzmiller Dover is definitely.
Yeah, where it was ruled that the ID was actually, well, the ID that was being pushed in that particular case was creationism in lipstick and a dress. It was calling itself the science of intelligent design, and it was ruled that no, this form of ID was not science, therefore had no place in a science class. And so I do think all of this comes down to the abhorrence of evolution. They want creationism to be given equal time in the science classroom. They've somehow got to change the definition of science.
Because at one point, I mean, I think in this, the lawyer actually got Michael Behe on this when he asked him, according to your definition of science, is astrology a science? And he said, yes. And I think back in Newton's day, it was considered a science as well. And interestingly enough, it was astrology that propelled Newton to become interested in science. and we have astrology to thank for Isaac Newton. Perhaps if Isaac Newton never got interested in science and just stuck to theology.
Yeah, which he showed some kind of disposition to do. But the thing is, the problem is with the demarcation problem is it's notoriously difficult to come up with a neat set of necessary and sufficient conditions as to what is and isn't science. I can't help feeling with the Kitzmiller-Dover case that the question would have been better asked: is this good science? You know, is this not whether is it in or outside some kind of sphere of what is and isn't science, but is this what scientists would regard as good science? Because the question is clearly no.
That is a critique against Popper, because there are times when he talks about things being pseudoscience as being non-science, and then there are other ways that he talks about it where he says that it is a lesser science, and those are two completely different things.
It is a critique of Popper, and I think it's one that's based on the notorious difficulty of giving a neat definition of what falls in and outside of a proper science, because that is notoriously difficult, and apologists like Plantinga exploit that for all it's worth. But by making the question perhaps more normative rather than one of demarcation, you know. Okay, yeah, I can see the difficulty in that legally, and so, but that's really a problem with the way America organises its educational system at a local level than it is with the actual concepts. Because if there isn't a clear way of saying this is science and this isn't science,
instead of asking that question, I think that it's more interesting to determine what provides the most fruitful scientific knowledge.
That's it. What'll yield trustworthy beliefs and what won't, and create if you read identity theories creationists ask us to do, it won't yield trustworthy beliefs. So it's that's why it shouldn't be taught in school, because life is too short and curriculums are too crowded.
Yeah. If you have an AP philosophy course, or if you're in debate club, bring those topics up. They're interesting in those contexts. But taught as science? Come on.
Moving back to the whole supernatural thing again, because I feel we're going down the old evolution v or science v creationism route, and that's specifically not what I wanted to do, although fun it is. Gary, are you familiar with an essay written by Gerard Tooft on on the supernatural?
No, the name sounds familiar, but I can't think of any particular essay off the top of my head.
I remember seeing this on his website around 15 years ago, so it was a long time. But Gerard Tooft is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist based in the Netherlands.
Right.
And he wrote on, and I think Sean Carroll did the same thing recently. It explained from a physics point of view why supernatural things aren't considered physics. And I think from what I can recall, it was to do with a scaling argument or a scaling? Yeah, scaling will do. Where he took these various supernatural things like telekinesis and various things like that, and said, okay, what sort of strengths these are compared, what sort of things that we would expect these to be in comparison to what we can measure. And I think what he concluded was that for, say, telekinesis to work, the strength of it must be within our measurable range that we have for our instruments.
Right.
We haven't seen that. We haven't seen that sort of level of activity within our measuring instruments. He then concluded that it mustn't be a real thing, because if it's in this sort of level of measurability, then we must have been able to measure it, and we haven't.
Well, my response to that would be, it's perhaps premature to say it's unreal or impossible, but it's certainly good reason not to have it as an option that you'd explore close to hand.
I mean, there's also one of the things that I argue quite similarly. If the supernatural does exist, then the interaction with it within the real world is so weak that we cannot measure it, or that it doesn't exist. And either way, from a practical point of view of getting down physical laws which we can describe the universe with, adding in something for the supernatural into the 23rd decimal place doesn't mean much, or even
in the context of the way our current theories stand.
Yes, from a modelling perspective, I no need to include something which is so small an effect. When I look at something so big, it's going to be absolutely negative.
Sure. And that's a really good reason not to do it, but it's not a good reason to say it's impossible.
Yeah, again, as I've been sort of trying to school myself saying saying that it's not possible, but just that looking at it from a modelling perspective, why add it in? Because it's so small an effect. All these other real natural effects which we can measure will just drown out whatever effect it will have. So if I want a useful model, then I'll not add anything in for this supernatural. And I don't know how. Again, people argue that you don't know what supernatural is and all this sort of thing. But I mean, from a pragmatic point of view, I think it's a perfectly good reason to go forward and not think about the supernatural.
It needn't worry you at the moment. It's not something that you need to concern yourself with, given the current state of affairs. And nobody can reasonably ask you to be concerned with it because of other state of affairs that aren't the case yet. So why not just, we seem to be doing okay without it. If in the future we're not doing okay without it, well, then we'll bring it into consideration as reason dictates. And I think as long as we stick to that, I think as long as we're not claiming that methodological naturalism is an axiom, then it isn't flawed. I think as soon as we start claiming that it is self-evident and beyond change, that's when it becomes flawed. And I think that's how I'd answer the question that's at the heart of this hangout.
Yeah, because that dips very much into the existence of the supernatural, which is of course where the opponents want to take it. Right? They're saying we're being dogmatic by not allowing it in because we're begging the question. We're saying that it doesn't exist. Sure. Whereas a more pragmatic, provisional approach is it's not as workable a model as the one we're currently using.
Sure, and you can actually, if you're an empiricist, you can actually be a provisional ontological naturalist as well. You can structure your idea of existence in accord with your best empirical theories, as long as you do so provisionally. So it's and that's to be honest with you, that's the reason I'm an atheist. Because I think the ontological picture painted by our best empirical theories, there's no supreme creator deity. QED, well, no, not QED, obviously, but that'll do.
Okay, so I'm reminded that we've almost been online for 2 hours. Do you think we've sufficiently answered the question and explored the whole thing of supernatural, how we measure it, how we bring it into our theories, and all things like that? I think the answer's been thoroughly answered. What say you?
What to the question, is methodological naturalism a flawed axiom in science? I'd say no.
Yes, I agree. It's not a flawed axiom because it's not an axiom. So if it's not an axiom,
Yeah. So any kind of
it's the
axiom. So,
modifier in front of it.
yeah.
Okay, so I'll stop the broadcast and we can invite some more people in. Okay, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.